March 14, 1983. The Federal Records Center in College Park, Maryland smelled of old paper and institutional disinfectant. Archivist Calvin Harlow reached into a filing cabinet marked Declassified 1982 and pulled out a manila folder stamped with fading red ink, Confidential. The reference number read F-8847/SRC-44. The designation SRC meant Subject Regular Contact, not Subject Under Investigation. Calvin opened the cover mechanically, expecting another routine background file from the war years. Then he stopped breathing. Typed on an old Underwood with a crooked lowercase e was a name he knew better than his own. Harlow, Dwight Cornelius, born 1919. Occupation: electrical engineer, Westinghouse Corporation, Pittsburgh facility. Operational designation: Beacon. His father, the man he'd buried 3 years ago, the man he'd loved and admired his entire life. Calvin didn't scream. His lungs simply stopped working. The archive reading room was quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Dust motes drifted in the weak March sunlight filtering through wire-reinforced windows. Somewhere across the room, his colleague Barbara Winslow was rustling through her own stack of documents. Life continued its ordinary rhythm. But in Calvin's hands lay a folder that was annihilating every memory of his father. He'd expected to find evidence of intimidation. Maybe the Bureau had questioned his father, pressured him, tried to recruit him. Calvin was prepared to discover his father as a victim. What he found was infinitely worse. His father had been the weapon. To understand how Calvin ended up in that archive, you need to go back 5 months. October 1982. America was deep in recession, unemployment hovering around 10%, factories closing across the Rust Belt. Calvin Harlow was 38 years old, working as an adjunct instructor at Georgetown University, teaching modern American history with a specialty in the home front during World War II. He'd finished his PhD dissertation on wartime industrial security and lived alone in a cramped basement apartment in Alexandria, Virginia. After his father's death, he'd sold the family house in Pittsburgh's Shadyside neighborhood. His mother had died when he was 17. No siblings, no extended family to speak of. The adjunct position paid poorly and offered no job security. By September, Calvin had burned through most of his savings and was eating ramen noodles for dinner 4 nights a week. When a letter arrived from something called the Historical Documentation Services Company, offering contract work reviewing declassified FBI files for historical researchers, he called the number without hesitation. The work was odd. He was to sort through recently declassified bureau files from the 1940s through 1960s, create inventories, and prepare documents for transfer to the National Archives. The pay was decent, $1,800 a month, cash payment. Calvin understood it was questionable work. Somebody was making serious money selling information from these files to private investigators, journalists, maybe even foreign intelligence services. But he needed to eat. He needed to pay rent. He showed up for his first shift at the Federal Records Center in College Park on a cold November morning and found himself surrounded by thousands of boxes containing the intimate details of American lives during the age of suspicion. Every day, he opened files on people long dead, read loyalty questionnaires, surveillance reports, informant statements. He learned to disconnect emotionally. This was just work, just history, just paper. But now, holding his father's file, he understood that history could be personal. And when it was personal, it became unbearable. Calvin closed the folder, glanced around. Barbara Winslow was still absorbed in her documents at the far end of the reading room. He stood up, slipped the folder inside his jacket, and walked toward the restroom. His heart hammered so loudly he was certain everyone could hear it. Removing files was absolutely forbidden. You could lose the contract, face federal charges, end up in serious legal trouble. But Calvin couldn't leave this folder here. Couldn't read it in the public reading room where someone might look over his shoulder. This was too intimate, too devastating. He locked himself in a toilet stall, hands trembling as he opened the file. 43 pages, typed on onion skin paper. The first document. Subject file for a confidential source. A photograph of his father, young, maybe 32 years old. Calvin recognized this picture. An identical copy hung in a frame back in Pittsburgh. Only there the inscription read, Westinghouse Engineering Department, 1951. His father in a dark suit, hair neatly parted, serious, dependable. Beneath the photograph, a form. Full name, Dwight Cornelius Harlow. Born, April 7, 1919, Youngstown, Ohio. Current employment, Westinghouse Electric Corporation, East Pittsburgh Facility, Design Engineering Section. Marital status, married. Spouse Janet Louise Harlow, née Patterson, born 1922. Children, none. The file was dated 1951. Calvin wouldn't be born until 1944. Date of recruitment, September 28, 1943. Basis, compromising information. Operational designation, __quote _4 __. Handling agent, Special Agent Lowell T. Kirkland. Status, active source, Category A reliability. Calvin turned the page. Recruitment interview report. He began reading and felt his stomach turn to ice. Interview memorandum dated September 28, 1943. Location, FBI Field Office, Pittsburgh District. Present, Special Agent Lowell T. Kirkland, Special Agent Raymond A. Moss, Civilian Dwight C. Harlow. The language was bureaucratic, clinical, but the picture emerged clearly through the official prose. A young engineer had been summoned for an interview. He was 24 years old, recently graduated from Carnegie Institute of Technology, recently married, just starting his career at Westinghouse, working on military contracts. His whole life stretched ahead. Then came the summons. They showed him photographs. The photographs showed him with a group of college friends taken in 1941. They were sitting in someone's dormitory room at Carnegie Tech, bottles of beer on the table, somebody holding a guitar. An ordinary college gathering, nothing suspicious. Except for one detail visible in the corner of the frame, a pamphlet. The pamphlet was titled, The Truth About Soviet Planning, published by the American-Russian Institute. Not illegal, but deeply suspicious in 1943. This was wartime. The Russians were allies, but there was paranoia about communist sympathizers, about industrial secrets being passed to Moscow, about security risks in defense plants. Someone with documented interest in Soviet literature, working on classified military equipment at Westinghouse, made the Bureau nervous. His father had been terrified. Of course he'd been terrified. He was 24. He wasn't a radical, wasn't a hero, wasn't anything except an ordinary American engineer who wanted to work, build a life, start a family. They offered him a choice. Either the photographs and pamphlet would be included in his security file, triggering an immediate investigation that would cost him his clearance, his job, possibly his freedom under the Smith Act. Or he could help the Bureau. Provide information about attitudes among his colleagues, report inappropriate political discussions, identify potential security risks. Nothing dramatic. Just serve as eyes and ears for national security. His father agreed. The memorandum contained his signature, Dwight Harlow. Confident, forward-slanting script. Calvin recognized that signature. His father had signed his report cards with the same hand. Calvin sat in that toilet stall and couldn't stop reading. Part of him wanted to condemn his father absolutely. Part of him searched desperately for justification. They'd forced him. He was 24. He'd been afraid. That's understandable. That's forgivable. But then came the other documents, and they offered no room for forgiveness. Informant reports, over 100 of them, brief, typed on thin paper, filed chronologically. From __quote _6 __. That's how his father signed his reports. Not with his real name, but with that cursed designation. Beacon. A light in the darkness. A guide for those hunting subversives. Calvin began reading. The early reports seemed harmless. His father reported overheard conversations in the cafeteria, complaints about management, grumbling about wages. Small stuff. Workplace gossip. Nothing serious. But gradually the tone changed. June 22, 1945. Beacon reports. Engineer Vernon P. Lattimore, born 1915, expressed criticism during lunch break regarding the use of atomic weapons against Japan. Stated that such weapons were immoral and that America should seek negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. Lattimore has influence with younger engineers. Recommend interview to assess loyalty. Calvin stopped. Lattimore. He knew that name. Vernon Lattimore had been his father's friend. They'd gone fishing together, celebrated holidays together. Uncle Vernon. Calvin had a faint childhood memory of him from when he was very young, maybe 5 or 6 years old, a tall man with kind eyes and a ready laugh. He died in the early 50s. His father had been deeply affected, withdrawn for weeks. Now it turned out his father had informed on him. Calvin kept reading. 3 pages later, he found a follow-up memo. Lattimore interviewed August 3, 1945. Security clearance suspended pending further review. Transferred from classified projects to general maintenance engineering. Career destroyed. Life derailed. Because of one conversation in a cafeteria. Because of one report from quote _8 _ from his father. Calvin read through the night in that bathroom stall, emerging only when he heard the cleaning crew arrive. He slipped the folder back under his jacket and went home. In his apartment, he spread the documents across his kitchen table and continued reading. Report after report, name after name. Some he recognized, most he didn't. Engineers, secretaries, technicians, managers, people whose only crime was expressing an opinion, attending the wrong meeting, knowing the wrong person. His father reported them all. December 1947. Purchasing agent Morris K. Felton attended a meeting of the Progressive Citizens of America, a left-leaning political group. Recommends surveillance. March 1949. Secretary Lorraine H. Prescott was observed reading the Daily Worker during her lunch break. Possible communist sympathies. September 1951. Draftsman Eugene R. McAllister questioned whether loyalty oaths were constitutional. Displays concerning attitudes. On and on. Year after year. Decade after decade. The Red Scare of the late 40s. The McCarthy era. The Cold War paranoia of the 50s and 60s. Through it all, his father faithfully reported, methodically documented, professionally betrayed. Some of the people his father informed on lost their jobs. Some faced FBI investigations. Some were called before congressional committees. Some were blacklisted, unable to find work anywhere in their field. Lives ruined. Families destroyed. All because Dwight Harlow, engineer, patriot, informant, filled out his reports and sent them to his handlers. The file contained commendations. Special Agent Kirkland, his original handler, wrote in 1955, Source Beacon continues to provide highly valuable information regarding potentially disloyal elements within the defense industrial sector. His reliability and discretion are exemplary. Recommend continuation of relationship. In 1962, a new handler, Special Agent Carson, wrote, Beacon has proven instrumental in identifying security risks at Westinghouse. His 30 years of service to the Bureau are appreciated. 30 years. From 1943 to 1973, according to the dates in the file. That's when the documentation ended, presumably when the FBI stopped using civilian informants so extensively. His father had continued for 7 more years after that, living quietly in retirement until his death in 1980. 30 years of betrayal, 30 years of lies, 30 years of destroying other people's lives while pretending to be their friend. Calvin didn't sleep that night, or the next. He called in sick to his contract work, unable to face returning to the archive. Instead, he sat in his apartment reading and rereading the file, trying to understand. Who was his father? The man who'd taught him to ride a bicycle? Who'd helped with math homework? Who'd come to his high school graduation and college commencement? Or was he this other person, this beacon, this professional betrayer? Could someone be both? As dawn broke on the third day, Calvin made a decision. He had to know more. Had to understand what happened to the people his father reported on. He made lists. 37 names appeared in the reports. 37 people whose lives his father had touched. Calvin began researching. The university library had old Pittsburgh newspapers on microfilm. He spent days scrolling through obituaries, employment records, city directories. Vernon Lattimore lost his engineering position at Westinghouse in 1945, worked odd jobs for 2 years, finally found work as a high school science teacher, died in 1951 of a heart attack, only 36 years old. Morris Felton, fired from Westinghouse in 1948, blacklisted, moved to Canada in 1952. Lorraine Prescott, resigned under pressure in 1949, unable to find secretarial work in Pittsburgh, left no forwarding address. Eugene McAllister, called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1952, refused to name associates, held in contempt of Congress, served 8 months in federal prison, released in 1953, worked as a grocery clerk until retirement. Some names he couldn't trace. They disappeared into America's vastness, fleeing their ruined reputations, trying to rebuild somewhere else. But enough remained visible to establish the pattern. His father's reports had devastated lives. These weren't just abstract historical figures. They were real people with families, dreams, fears. People who'd said the wrong thing to the wrong person. And that person had been Dwight Harlow. Calvin found himself unable to continue his normal life. He stopped going to his adjunct teaching position, stopped attending his contract archive work, spent entire days in libraries tracking down more information. His savings evaporated. He stopped paying rent. His landlord threatened eviction. Calvin didn't care. Nothing mattered except understanding what his father had done. In April 1983, he made another decision. He would tell the truth. He would expose what his father had been. Not for revenge, not for justice, but because the truth mattered. Because silence was complicity. He contacted the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, explained what he'd found. They were skeptical at first, but when he showed them photocopies of the FBI documents, they understood the story's significance. An investigative reporter named Ellen Vargas was assigned to work with him. They spent weeks verifying information, tracking down survivors, piecing together the broader context. The article ran on February 6, 1984. Front page, above the fold. ___, quote, _12__. The story detailed everything. Calvin's discovery of the file, his father's recruitment, the 30 years of reporting, the names of some of the victims, the impact on their lives. Calvin was quoted extensively. He spoke honestly about his anguish, his sense of betrayal, his struggle to reconcile the father he'd loved with the informant he'd discovered. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Some people praised Calvin for his courage, called him a hero for revealing the truth regardless of personal cost. Others condemned him, called him a traitor to his father's memory, said he should have remained silent, that every generation had to make difficult choices during dangerous times. The letters poured in, some from victims' families, thanking him for acknowledging their suffering. Some from former informants' families, angry that he'd exposed their own secrets. The Post-Gazette piece was picked up by national media. Time magazine ran a feature. 60 Minutes wanted to interview him. Suddenly, Calvin Harlow was a public figure, the face of a national conversation about loyalty, betrayal, and historical reckoning. But the public attention came at a cost. Calvin received death threats, anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, letters containing graphic descriptions of what the writers wanted to do to him. His apartment was broken into twice, his possessions ransacked. The police offered little help. Some cops were sympathetic. Others made clear they considered him a disgrace for exposing his father. Calvin's professional life collapsed. Georgetown terminated his adjunct position, citing concerns about professional judgment and institutional reputation. The Historical Documentation Services Company canceled his contract and threatened legal action for removing the FBI file. Other universities where he applied for positions rejected him without explanation. He was effectively blacklisted, ironically experiencing the same fate his father had inflicted on others. By summer 1984, Calvin was broke, unemployed, and living in a homeless shelter in D.C. He'd lost everything. But he'd told the truth. That was what mattered. In October 1984, something unexpected happened. A group of civil rights attorneys contacted him. They represented several elderly individuals who'd been victims of FBI informant networks during the Cold War. They wanted Calvin to testify at congressional hearings examining FBI domestic surveillance programs. Calvin agreed. He appeared before a House Judiciary Subcommittee in March 1985, sat at a witness table facing rows of congressmen and television cameras, told his story calmly, methodically, explained how ordinary citizens had been turned into surveillance tools, how fear had been weaponized, how the machinery of suspicion had operated. His testimony was devastating, not because it was dramatic, but because it was mundane. He showed how the system worked, not through grand conspiracies, but through thousands of small betrayals. How people like his father, decent in most respects, could become instruments of oppression simply by following instructions. The hearings led to reforms. The FBI was forced to acknowledge abuses. Informant programs were curtailed. Compensation funds were established for some victims. It wasn't justice, but it was something. After the hearings, Calvin tried to rebuild. He found work at a nonprofit organization researching civil liberties abuses. The pay was minimal, but it gave him purpose. He wrote articles, gave speeches at universities, participated in documentary films. He became, whether he wanted to or not, an expert on domestic surveillance and informant networks. He never returned to Pittsburgh. The city held too many ghosts. His childhood home had been sold. His father's engineering colleagues were mostly dead or scattered. There was nothing to return to except memory, and memory had become unbearable. In 1987, he began teaching again. A small liberal arts college in Vermont offered him a visiting position teaching American history. The course he developed was titled __quote, _14, ___. It examined how fear shaped American culture, how ordinary people became complicit in systems of control, how the line between security and oppression was constantly negotiated. His students were fascinated and disturbed. Many came from conservative backgrounds, children of Reagan Republicans who believed in America's essential goodness. Calvin's course challenged that narrative, showed them the shadows beneath the shining city on the hill. Some students resisted, argued that his father and men like him were patriots who'd done necessary work in dangerous times, that communism had been a real threat, that some sacrifices of liberty were justified for security. Calvin didn't argue with them. He simply presented the evidence. Let them read the reports, see the names, learn what had happened to those people. Let them decide for themselves whether it had been worth it. Other students were radicalized by the course, became activists, protesters, champions of civil liberties. They wrote papers comparing Cold War informant networks to contemporary surveillance technologies, drew lines between his father's generation and their own, asked hard questions about what they would do in similar circumstances. Calvin encouraged the questioning. That was the point. Not to provide answers, but to force confrontation with difficult truths. Years passed. Calvin remained at the Vermont College, eventually receiving tenure. It was a small victory, but significant. He'd been institutionally validated, professionally rehabilitated. He published articles in academic journals, contributed chapters to history books. His work was respected in scholarly circles, though mainstream historians often found it too uncomfortable, too personal. In 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended. Suddenly, the entire ideological structure that had justified his father's actions crumbled. What had it all been for? The betrayals, the destroyed lives, the decades of suspicion. To defeat an enemy that imploded from its own contradictions? Calvin gave interviews about this. He was asked whether he felt vindicated. He said no. Vindication wasn't the point. The point was memory. The point was ensuring that when the next crisis came, when the next wave of fear swept the country, people would remember what had happened before. Would remember how easily ordinary citizens could become informants, how quickly rights could be surrendered in the name of security, how long it took to recover what was lost. In 1995, he received a letter from a woman named Patricia Lattimore. She was Vernon Lattimore's daughter, now in her 60s. She thanked Calvin for revealing the truth about her father's persecution. Vernon had died without ever understanding why his career had been destroyed, why his security clearance had been revoked. He'd blamed himself, wondered what he'd done wrong. Patricia wrote, __quote _15__. Calvin kept the letter. It was one of the few things that made him feel the price he'd paid had been worthwhile. But there were other letters too, from people who hated him, who thought he'd dishonored his father, who believed some truths should remain buried. He kept those letters as well. They were part of the story too. In 2001, the September 11th attacks transformed America again. Suddenly, surveillance was justified in new terms. The War on Terror replaced the Cold War as the organizing principle of American security culture. The Patriot Act passed with overwhelming support. Civil liberties were again curtailed. Fear again became the dominant political emotion. Calvin watched with a sense of horrible familiarity. He gave interviews pointing out the parallels. How easily Americans abandoned principles under pressure. How quickly the machinery of suspicion could be reactivated. How little had been learned from the past. Some people listened. Most didn't. The few voices warning about surveillance overreach were drowned out by the chorus demanding security at any cost. History, Calvin realized, didn't teach, it repeated. In 2008, he was invited to speak at a conference in Washington examining FBI domestic surveillance programs. The conference was organized by civil liberties groups, attended by activists, academics, former intelligence officials trying to reckon with their past. Calvin's presentation focused on his father. He showed slides of the FBI documents, read excerpts from the reports, explained the human cost of each betrayal. After his talk, an elderly man approached. He introduced himself as Lawrence Kirkland, retired FBI agent. Calvin recognized the name immediately. Lowell Kirkland, his father's original handler, had died in the 1970s. This was his brother. Lawrence Kirkland said, quote, 16. Calvin responded, quote, 17. Kirkland nodded slowly, quote, 18. It was the closest Calvin would ever come to an apology from the system that had used his father. It wasn't enough, but it was something. In 2013, Edward Snowden revealed the extent of NSA surveillance programs. The entire American digital communications infrastructure had been compromised. Every phone call, every email, every web search potentially monitored. The surveillance state his father had served in analog form had gone digital, expanded exponentially. Calvin was 69 years old by then. He'd spent 30 years teaching, writing, speaking about surveillance. And still it continued. Still it grew. He wondered whether anything he'd done had mattered, whether his father's exposure had changed anything, whether truth had any power against institutions determined to maintain control. He kept teaching. What else could he do? His students now carried computers in their pockets, were tracked by corporations, monitored by government algorithms. They'd grown up under surveillance, accepted it as normal. Calvin tried to show them it wasn't normal, tried to help them understand what had been lost. Most found it abstract. History, something old people worried about. Their phones tracked their location. Their browsing history was sold to advertisers. Their photos were stored on servers owned by private companies. And they didn't care because they weren't doing anything wrong. The same logic that had justified his father's work. If you're innocent, you have nothing to hide. If you've done nothing wrong, why fear surveillance? Calvin knew how dangerous that logic was. But he was tired. So tired. In 2016, Calvin Harlow was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Terminal. The doctors gave him 6 months, maybe a year with treatment. He declined treatment. He was 72 years old. He'd lived long enough. He was ready to be done. He spent his final months in his small house in Vermont, surrounded by boxes of documents, decades of research, thousands of pages of his father's FBI file that he'd managed to obtain through Freedom of Information Act requests. He'd planned to write a book, a comprehensive history of civilian informant networks during the Cold War, using his father as the central case study. He'd been working on it for years. It was almost finished, but he wouldn't complete it. The cancer moved faster than expected. In February 2017, Calvin Harlow died. He was 73 years old. His funeral was small. A dozen former students, a few academic colleagues, some activists from civil liberties organizations. No family. He'd never married, never had children. The Harlow line ended with him. He was buried in a cemetery in Burlington, Vermont, far from Pittsburgh, far from his father. He'd arranged it that way. He didn't want to lie next to the man whose secrets had defined his life. His will established a foundation, the Calvin Harlow Civil Liberties Research Center. All his papers, all his research, all the documents he'd collected over 3 decades went to the University of Vermont Library. Open to researchers. Available to anyone who wanted to study how surveillance worked, how ordinary people became informants, how systems of control operated. The book he'd been writing was edited and published posthumously in 2018. Quote, 19 became a critical success, widely reviewed, used in college courses across the country. It told his father's story completely, unflinchingly. And it told Calvin's story too. How he'd discovered the truth, how he'd chosen to reveal it, how that choice had cost him everything. The book's final chapter, written months before Calvin's death, contained these words. __, quote _ 20 __. The book sold well, won awards, was praised by historians and civil libertarians. Conservative critics attacked it as revisionist, unpatriotic, damaging to national security. The arguments were predictable, the positions were entrenched. Nothing changed. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic arrived. Suddenly, contact tracing became a public health imperative. Surveillance technologies were deployed to track infections, enforce quarantines, monitor compliance. Many Americans accepted this readily. After all, it was for public health. It was temporary. It was necessary. Others pointed to Calvin Harlow's work, warned that emergency powers rarely expired, that surveillance infrastructure once established found new justifications, that fear always demanded more control. The debates raged on social media, in op-ed pages, in congressional hearings. The same arguments that had been made during the Cold War, during the War on Terror, during every crisis in American history. Security versus liberty, safety versus freedom, community versus individual. The balance was always being negotiated. The equilibrium was never stable. In 2023, the Calvin Harlow Civil Liberties Research Center hosted a symposium marking the 40th anniversary of Calvin's discovery of his father's file. Scholars presented papers on informant networks, surveillance culture, historical memory. Former victims of FBI informant programs shared their stories. Young activists discussed contemporary surveillance issues. The symposium's theme was underscore, quote, underscore 21 underscore underscore. But had America learned? The surveillance had grown more sophisticated, the justifications had evolved, but the fundamental dynamic remained unchanged. Power demanded information. Information required surveillance. Surveillance needed informants. And informants were always ordinary people. People like Dwight Harlow, engineer, father, patriot, betrayer, human. That was the most frightening word in the entire story. Human. Because it meant, this could be anyone. This could be you. This could be me. Under the right circumstances, with the right pressure, nobody is immune. Calvin Harlow had crossed that line, but in the opposite direction from his father. He'd chosen not to be an informant, but a witness, someone who remembered and testified. It didn't make him a hero, but it made him human. Real human, unbroken by the fear of uncomfortable truth. And that was his achievement. Small, overlooked by most, but genuine. The final exhibit in the Calvin Harlow Research Center is a letter Calvin wrote shortly before his death. It hangs by the exit. Every visitor reads it on their way out. The letter says, underscore, quote, underscore 22, underscore. Simple words, but they contain his entire life, all his pain, all his hope. That someone will listen, someone will understand, someone won't repeat the mistakes of the past. Maybe that's naive, maybe it's pointless, but it was all he could do. And he did it, until the end. The Calvin Harlow Civil Liberties Research Center remains open. People visit, researchers examine the documents, students write papers. They learn about the cost of surveillance, the price of betrayal, the difficulty of truth. Some are moved, some are indifferent, but all take away knowledge. This happened. This can happen again, and only we can prevent it. History never ends. It only repeats. In different forms, with different technologies, in different contexts, but the essence remains. Power requires control. Control requires information. Information requires betrayal. And betrayers are ordinary people. Like Dwight Harlow. Like any of us. That's the hardest knowledge of all. Harder than guilt. Harder than truth. The knowledge that the line between victim and perpetrator is thinner than we imagine, and that anyone can cross it. Calvin Harlow crossed it, but toward witness rather than informant, toward truth rather than silence. It didn't save him, didn't bring him happiness or peace, but it made him free. Free from complicity, free from the corruption of silence. And in that freedom was his victory, small, unmarked, but real. The Harlow story ends with a question posed by a student during a 2024 seminar at the Research Center. She asked, quote, 23. The seminar leader, a historian who'd studied Calvin's work for decades, answered, quote, 24. The student nodded. She didn't look satisfied. But understanding history rarely brings satisfaction. Only responsibility. The weight of knowing what came before. The obligation to do better. And the knowledge that doing better is harder than it sounds. Calvin Harlow learned that, spent his entire life learning it. And now his work passes to others, to students, researchers, activists, anyone willing to carry the burden of uncomfortable truth. The truth that surveillance corrupts, that fear justifies atrocity, that ordinary people become monsters in small increments, and that fighting these tendencies requires constant vigilance, constant courage, constant willingness to face the worst in ourselves and our society. This is Calvin Harlow's legacy, not the discovery of his father's betrayal, but the choice to reveal it. to remember it, to teach it, to ensure that at least some people, in some small way, understand what happened and why it must never happen again. Though it probably will, because history repeats, systems persist, power corrupts, fear controls, and ordinary people, when pressured enough, will betray. That's the lesson. Terrible, true, unchanging. But knowing it matters. Remembering it matters. Teaching it matters. Even if it doesn't prevent the next betrayal, the next surveillance state, the next informant network. At least some will know. Some will recognize what's happening. Some will resist. That's all Calvin achieved. Recognition, memory, witness. It doesn't seem like much. Against the vast machinery of state control, against centuries of surveillance culture, against human nature itself, what can one person's testimony accomplish? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Calvin died not knowing, died hoping someone would listen, someone would learn, someone would choose differently. His father chose betrayal. He chose truth. Between those two choices lies the entire moral space of human existence. We all inhabit that space. We all face those choices. Every day, in small ways, the choice to report or remain silent, to surveil or trust, to fear or courage. We make those choices, and our choices make history. Calvin Harlow's choice made this story. His father's choice made another story. Both stories are real. Both stories continue. They echo through time, touching lives, shaping understanding, forming the sediment of cultural memory. This is how societies learn. Through stories of betrayal and witness, through examples of failure and resistance, through the painful excavation of uncomfortable truths. Calvin spent his life excavating, digging through archives, uncovering secrets, revealing what had been hidden. He paid for that work with his career, his peace, his privacy, ultimately his health. But he did it, and the truth he revealed remains. In archives, in books, in courses, in conversations, in the minds of everyone who encounters his story and decides what it means to them. That's all any of us can do. Tell the truth, remember the past, hope someone listens, and continue despite the certainty that the struggle never ends, because surveillance never ends, fear never ends, the temptation to betray never ends, but neither does the possibility of resistance, the choice to witness rather than inform, to remember rather than forget, to teach rather than hide. Calvin made that choice, not once but repeatedly, every day for 3 decades. That's heroism, not the dramatic kind, the exhausting kind. The kind that grinds you down slowly but doesn't break you. The kind that costs everything and pays back nothing except the cold satisfaction of having told the truth. He told it. The truth remains. And somewhere, someone is reading Calvin Harlow's story, learning about his father, learning about surveillance, learning about the cost of betrayal and the price of truth. Maybe they'll learn enough to make different choices. Maybe they'll become informants anyway. Maybe they'll be the ones surveilled. Maybe they'll be the ones who choose to remember. We don't know. Calvin didn't know. But he tried. That's his epitaph. He tried. And in trying, he showed what's possible. Not victory, not redemption, just the possibility of choosing truth over comfort, memory over silence, witness over complicity. That possibility remains, for all of us, always. The Calvin Harlow story never ends, because the choice it represents never ends. Every generation faces it. Every individual confronts it. We can be Dwight Harlow, the informant, or Calvin Harlow, the witness, or someone else entirely, finding a third path we haven't imagined yet. The story asks us to choose, not once, but continuously. until we die or the world changes so fundamentally that the choice no longer matters. Neither seems likely. So we choose, and choosing makes us human, with all that implies: capacity for betrayal, capacity for courage, capacity for both, and the terrible responsibility of deciding which capacity we'll exercise. Calvin exercised courage, imperfectly, painfully, incompletely, but genuinely. That's enough. It has to be. Because perfect courage doesn't exist. Perfect truth doesn't exist. Perfect memory doesn't exist. Only human attempts. Flawed, limited, compromised, but real. Calvin Harlow was real. His father was real. The people they affected were real. The legacy is real. And it's ours now, to carry forward or forget. The choice is always ours. That's the story. That's the lesson. That's the burden. And it never ends.